China, the fourth largest country in the world, has more than just good geography going for it. Its impressive landmass, supported by a skilled workforce, has been successfully channeled into progress over the decades. Hanging on to an unparalleled 10% growth rate for several decades, China's GDP went from $178 billion in the 80s to a whopping $14.72 trillion now, turning it into one of the biggest economies in the world, playing second fiddle only to the US. Boasting a burgeoning middle and upper class with bottomless pockets, the country has undoubtedly emerged as a global force to be reckoned with. This jewel in the crown of the Far East has become a contender for global superpower status in the present day and age, one of a triad on the cusp of global domination. So, if things are going so well in the Orient, why are the Chinese citizens looking for greener pastures across the seas and putting their lives in danger trying to sneak into the US? What does the US have that China doesn't have? These people have bigger problems than that, like economic stagnation, religious repression, and political persecution, which are the usual suspects in Far East nations. Here's an in-depth look into the factors driving the exodus from China. Gate-crashing the party. The number of legal Chinese immigrants into the US has skyrocketed in recent years, but where a legal visa is not forthcoming, Chinese locals are willing to take the law into their own hands by giving US Border Patrol a run for their money. All these TikTok-savvy migrants have to do is find easy-to-follow tips and route advice after getting to Ecuador, which has no visa requirements for Chinese nationals, and they're good to go. But they're not the usual fare sneaking across the border. These migrants are a class apart as they pay good money to the traffickers with $850 a pop up front and are taken along a much easier and deluxe path through the jungles. Mixing in with the Latin Americans, they trek through the once treacherous Darien, crossing several Central American borders before penetrating U.S. soil. Zhaoxin, or Walk the Line, is the Chinese name of this journey, and no, it's not the Chinese equivalent of beach limbo. The Mexican border with the U.S. has become an area of high traffic with the number of undocumented immigrants coming across the borders. According to reports, Border Patrol arrested 22,187 Chinese individuals for crossing the border illegally from Mexico from January through September 2023, nearly 13 times more from the same period in 2022. Up 70% from August, 4,010 were arrested in September. And matters are getting worse with the border heating up further with illegal traffic. For example, the Panamanian immigration authorities registered 15,567 Chinese citizens crossing the Darien within the first 9 months of 2023. These figures have shocked the bigwigs in the U.S. since the present numbers have blossomed from just 2,005 Chinese people trekking through the rainforest in 2022 to just 376 in total from 2010 to 2021. The question we need to ask ourselves is, what are these people searching for as they make a beeline for the US? Or are they running away from something in China? From the century of humiliation to the century of prosperity. It's an indisputable fact that China has risen through its very own ashes like the proverbial phoenix, but it hasn't been able to shed its shadows fully. China's thirst for reinvention has its roots in a bleak history, which it still remembers as a century of humiliation. Chinese historians and nationalists consider this period starting from its first defeat in the Opium War with the British in 1842 and the occupation of Hong Kong after the unraveling of the Qing dynasty as the start of a series of humiliations it suffered for a whole century. They might have a point there, since it was only the beginning of protracted skirmishes with the French, the British, and the Russians, as China was drawn and quartered by its neighbors and invaders. The Anglo-French forces looted its famous Summer Palace in the Second Opium War of 1856 to 1860, and it lost Outer Manchuria to Russia. It lost influence and suzerainty over Vietnam due to its war with the French, and lost Taiwan and Korea as a result of its wars with Japan. In short, the process of Chinese degradation continued until the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War, which ended in 1945. It hasn't forgotten how it suffered major internal fragmentation, lost almost all of the wars it fought, and had to concede to its enemies' unreasonable and humiliating demands. By the end of that century, China had been forced to pay large amounts of reparations and was forced to open up ports for trade with its rivals. It leased or ceded territories such as Outer Manchuria, parts of Manchuria and Sakhalin to the Russian Empire, Jiaozhou Bay to the German Empire, Hong Kong and Weihai to the British Empire, Macau to the Portuguese Empire, Zhejiang to France, Taiwan and Dalian to Japan. During this time, China was treated like the weakest kid, surrounded by neighborhood bullies. and the trauma seemed to have followed it into its century of prosperity. In the middle of this chaos, the Second World War proved to be the most unlikely of saviors, proving that one man's destruction can be another man's salvation. While the good guys of the Second World War became tied up with Germany, Italy, and Japan, China used the chaos to its advantage and snatched its ceded territories back from its classical rivals. Although this was a major win, China still had a long way to go before it can consider itself safe from the choppy waters. Freshly emerging from the devastation of Japanese and Western extraterritoriality in the post-World War II stage, the two protagonists of the Chinese Civil War, the Nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party, picked up arms against each other. While the CCP eventually made its victory speech under the leadership of Mao Zedong, the Nationalists converged on Taiwan, thus setting off the first threat to China from within. What followed was a national initiative to drive out all Western influences and eliminate such presence from China. Mao's answer to China's problems was rapid economic progress. China's falling out with the Soviet Union and its acquisition of nuclear capability were stepping stones to its ultimate goal of Chinese revival. While Mao indulged the country in dubious strategies like the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, it drove China's development back, proving that Mao could not walk the talk. China's economic prosperity is coming full circle. From 1979 onwards, Deng Xiaoping put China on its present path of economic revival and development, making it a game-changer on the global landscape. Mao's successors successfully achieved the goals he had set in their own way. The Chinese dream had finally come true. According to World Bank data, China's years of high GDP growth meant its economy ballooned more than tenfold during the turn of the century, and 2021, from $1.2 trillion to nearly $18 trillion. Its open-door policy led to it plucking 800 million people from the jaws of poverty and adding them to its rapidly expanding middle class, with significant improvements in access to health, education, and other services, making China an upper-middle-income country. But how can it be explained why its citizens are abandoning it and choosing to settle in the US by hook or crook? That's because the Chinese economic bubble is collapsing. The chickens are coming home to roost, and the same policies China has adopted to expedite its economic growth are boomeranging on it. You see, the mainstay of the Chinese economic policy has been investment-based high growth, low-cost manufacturing, and exports, which have reached the end of the road in terms of results. China's obsessive reliance on government spending and commercial investment for economic development in place of consumer spending has become its greatest liability, which would have led to more organic and sustainable economic growth. The 2008 financial crisis forced local governments in China to invest heavily in domestic infrastructure and property development on the premise that property prices would increase. The real estate bubble burst. Major property developers such as Evergrande went bankrupt, and entire ghost cities are sitting abandoned across the country. As expected, China's growth rate has stagnated at 5%, and its policies have led to serious economic, social, and environmental imbalances. Another culprit is the specter of an aging population, which is the mother of all the ironies that have happened to the most populous country on the planet. According to Al Jazeera, the share of China's population in the 15 to 64 age group is shrinking after peaking at just under 1 billion in 2015. The Council on Foreign Relations has sounded the alarm with its report China's population fell by 2 million in 2023, marking the second straight year of decline. Statistics suggest that China's total fertility rate, which has steadily declined from 1.5 births per woman in the late 1990s to 1.15 in 2021, is now approaching 1.0, far below the replacement level of 2.1 that would maintain the current population levels. Overall, China's population fell by 2.09 million people last year to 1.41 billion in 2023. The country recorded only 9 million births in 2023, which were more than offset by 11.1 million deaths. The birth rate was down 500,000 from 2022, continuing a multi-year trend. Policymakers have realized that for China to be able to sustain its population, each female must bear at least 2.1 babies. Even though the PRC is encouraging women to have kids, the ladies are not taking the bait. Might we see a two-child policy emerge in China in the coming years? The only way to break out of the corner China's boxed itself into is by restructuring and revamping the entire economic structure. While Chinese policymakers are brainstorming some new ideas for a second economic revival, Chinese citizens have increasingly decided not to stick around and are abandoning ship. While Chinese strategists might be reopening their Confucius books the common man in China has been bearing the brunt of a stagnating economy. Just look at the case of Wu Xiaohua, 42, who said he opted to take one of those quicker journeys so he could reach the US without wasting precious time and get to work. Originally from Hunan province, Xiaohua moved to Shanghai to work as a taxi driver, but found it a struggle since the pandemic. He claimed the economy was a mess and that it was hard to provide basic care for his family. Another migrant left Beijing 2 months after China's strict COVID-19 lockdowns terminated her employment as a masseuse, leaving her destitute and barely able to survive day to day. Such stories abound amongst the migrants steadily trickling in, traffic which is not about to cease until the Chinese economy turns around. Yet, is a sinking economy the only factor propelling Chinese locals to leave their own country in droves? The story is much more complex than that. Hiking economic scale, diving freedom scale. The phenomenon of Chinese migrants moving to the US has been a rude wake-up call to Chinese policymakers, even as they keep a stiff upper lip. Looking back at China's revival in the post-Maoist era, the stark difference between China's economic development as opposed to its political development is clear for all to see. As a careful opening of Chinese markets was allowed, it was balanced with increasing muzzling of political dissidents, so much so that there is a complete absence of political diversity and expression. Of course, you can't ignore that it's not just political thought that has been suppressed, but all forms of self-expression, political, religious, media, and art, have all been muzzled by state authorities. China's present aversion to political freedoms and freedom of expression stems from Mao's beloved Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution was Mao's brainchild, which was meant to make him the undisputed king of all he surveyed and help him consolidate power in his hands. In 1966, he started by placing key cultural and educational policy-making powers in the hands of select army personnel. What followed was a singling out of political and educational thinkers and teachers and an activation of the student bodies in support of state policies. According to Britannica, Mao had 4 aims he wanted to achieve through the Cultural Revolution: to replace his designated successors with leaders more faithful to his current thinking, to rectify the CCP, to provide China's youth with a revolutionary experience, and to achieve specific policy changes to make the educational, healthcare, and cultural systems less elitist. Even though the only rewards Mao found were turmoil across the length and breadth of China, he was able to stifle all forms of freedom of expression, be it political, religious, or personal. The resultant turmoil led to 1968, when Mao rebuilt the CCP and brought things under greater control. The military dispatched officers and soldiers to take over schools, factories, and government agencies, and China holistically went into the clutches of state control. Interestingly, the seeds sown by Mao have taken such deep roots that even though the Chinese society flourishes, state control in all facets of Chinese lives remains strong. However, the type of suppression in China today is far more insidious. The days are gone when people are rounded up and given VIP treatment with batons. According to Human Rights Watch, now Chinese officials are more organized in their methods by putting in place a registration process administered by the State Council's Religious Affairs Bureau, through which the government monitors membership in religious organizations, locations of meetings, religious training, selection of clergy, publication of religious materials, and funding for religious activities. So why would you think China is so anti-religion? For one simple reason: its only concession to a deity is communism, which transcends all loyalties. China is also wary of experiences of Soviet Russia, which found its hands tied by the Christian Orthodox Church. Today's China controls each and every aspect of religion, from allowing the practice of only 5 religions it recognizes to keeping a keen eye on all activities of the registered religious centers. The persecution of the Tibetan Buddhists and the Muslim Uyghurs is a clear violation of human freedoms. International bodies like the United Nations Human Rights Council Universal Periodic Review and Human Rights Watch have regularly accused the Chinese Communist Party, the government of the People's Republic of China, of using harsh measures to stifle public opinion and religious practices. The 2020 World Press Freedom Index, compiled by Reporters Without Borders, shows that China is the world's biggest jailer of journalists. They also allege that mainland China is trying to establish a new world media order by maintaining information hyper-control. Proof of its suppressive tendencies were seen by the world when it imprisoned 2 Chinese bloggers for sharing coverage of the COVID crisis. China currently detains around 100 journalists, of whom the vast majority are Uyghurs. It's alleged that its notorious Golden Shield can monitor online chatting services and mail identifying IPs and arresting people when required. The situation has become even more extreme since Xi Jinping secured a third term as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, making him the country's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong by manipulating the state apparatus under him. Since then, the repression has become even more brutal. Exactly how ruthless the Chinese state apparatus can become was witnessed by the world as the state imprisoned its citizens under a positively draconian lockdown during the coronavirus pandemic. People were locked within their own homes and in many cases not allowed to venture out under any circumstances. The situation was pretty dire the world over, but China set its name in stone with the extreme measures it took in pursuit of a zero-COVID policy. People complained of difficulty in securing food and essential medical services, leading to people dying in their own homes. Such human rights violations cannot be ignored in a civilized world, and 8 states boycotted China's bid to host the 2022 Olympics, which upset Xi to no end. Tibet, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang are hotspots for human rights violations. But when Chinese officials face proof of their repressive policies, all they show are non-committal shrugs. China might deny it all at once, but its illegal migrants tell a different tale. With only a backpack, a portable tent, and a small shoulder bag, Kong, a 47-year-old Chinese migrant, was one of more than a dozen migrants trying their luck in getting to the U.S. Kong got a lot of information from online sources about how to make the trek, including Douyin, which is a Chinese version of TikTok. After half a year of planning, I decided I must go. When I came out, I decided it's going to be worth it even if I die on the way, he confessed to the VOA reporter. When asked why he traveled thousands of miles to a country he had never visited before, he replied, "Freedom. I want freedom." Kong has been the victim of state censorship when his Douyin account was banned several times for using sensitive keywords and criticizing Chinese President Xi Jinping. Despite its best efforts, with over 5 decades of schooling by the state of China, it could not beat the need for self-expression out of Kong. This should help it realize that it's trying to snuff out the spirit of its nation, which is not a possibility in human society, hysteria, or caution in the U.S. The bemused U.S. has been viewing the slow and steady trickle of Chinese migrants through its borders, and it's finally decided to question the whys and wherefores of the movement. The U.S. security apparatus is giving this activity the stink eye and sharing national security concerns that there could be Chinese spies amongst the incoming stragglers. But it's the politicians who are not satisfied with the mere questioning. The first stone has been flung by Republican Representative Mark Green, chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, who questioned why the majority are military-age men with known ties to the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and the People's Liberation Army. Green and fellow Republican Senator Marco Rubio and Representative Troy E. Nehls have gone so far as to introduce the No Asylum for CCP Spies Act in 2023, which, if passed, would prevent CCP members from seeking asylum in the U.S. Now check out why China's artificial islands are now sinking, or watch this video instead.